In the glamorous world of Hollywood, Ron Howard represents the quintessential gentleman. We remember him as the courteous young man and reliable filmmaker. However, staying at the top for 6 decades requires more than just charm. It requires an unbreakable armor. Behind that legendary smile lies a journey fraught with difficult moments and clashes of dominant personalities. Howard didn't just witness cinematic greatness, he lived through it and survived. These are the 6 performers who tested his temperament and revealed the industry's rougher edges. Henry Winkler, the paradox of the partner. The most intricate tension in Ron Howard's career did not arise from an adversary, but from his best friend. On the set of Happy Days, Howard played the undisputed protagonist, Richie Cunningham, upon whom all the nostalgia for the 1950s was built. But after a few seasons, an unexpected cultural phenomenon occurred. Henry Winkler's Fonzie not only gained popularity, but became the soul of the show. For Howard, this was the ultimate test of ego. He found himself caught in the sidekick paradox, a circumstance where his character remained the moral core, but his status in the eyes of the industry was gradually eroded by a supporting actor dressed in leather. The tension here was unique because it lacked personal animosity. Howard and Winkler professed genuine affection for each other. Winkler was and continues to be the godfather of Howard's children. Nevertheless, the conflict was structural. Howard has acknowledged that the network's treatment of him changed practically overnight. Executives began to address him with a lack of consideration that was painful. There was even a proposal to rename the show Fonzie's Happy Days, a decision so offensive to Howard's professional reputation that he threatened to leave the series. He was not jealous of Winkler's success. He was simply defending his own dignity. This experience was a lesson in the fleeting nature of stardom. How? Quickly, Hollywood discards a reliable workhorse to replace it with a flashy stallion. Howard handled this situation with a maturity beyond his chronological age, an expression that Winkler himself uses to describe the young Howard of those years. While the press tried to foster a media rivalry, Howard remained focused on his work. He recognized that Winkler's brilliance benefited the show, but he also understood that he could no longer remain in an environment where he was treated as a second-class citizen. This friction became the fundamental catalyst for his transition into directing. If the network didn't respect him as an actor, he would be the one hiring the actors in the future. In recent years, both have discussed this period openly in interviews and podcasts. Howard confessed candidly, it hurt. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for a man who usually keeps his emotions in check. This story underscores the most human friction of all, the pain of being overshadowed by someone you care about. Howard's ability to preserve his friendship with Winkler while processing that professional pain is perhaps his most significant achievement off-screen. He proved that being a good person is not a weakness, but a manifestation of extraordinary emotional intelligence. Winkler not only provided Richie Cunningham with a co-star, he provided the definitive push Ron Howard needed to stop playing characters and start building a true film empire. Tom Sizemore, The Lost Path. While Russell Crowe represented the fire of artistic genius, Tom Sizemore embodied a much more tragic form of Hollywood friction, the gradual collapse of professional reliability. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Sizemore was one of the industry's most sought-after tough guy actors, a powerful performer capable of sharing the screen with giants such as Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks. But when his paths crossed with Ron Howard, particularly during the production of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where he had a brief uncredited role, and in the wider industry circles where Howard operated, Sizemore was becoming the living symbol of irresponsibility fueled by vice. For Howard, a man who conceives of the film set as a sacred collaborative family, Sizemore's presence was a painful introduction to the most unpredictable shadow of the craft. Sizemore's problem was not a malicious intent to harm the film, but rather a total abandonment of his professional contract due to substance abuse. Howard's sets are grounded in the work ethic of the American Midwest. Arrive early, know your lines, and respect the crew. Sizemore, caught in the grip of severe addiction, often lived in direct opposition to those core values. He became a figure of unintended friction and disaffection. Unlike a diva who demands more trailers or a perfectionist who requests more takes, an actor battling addiction creates a void of collective anxiety. Every day he appears on the call sheet as an unknown. The director doesn't wonder if the scene will be masterful. He wonders if the actor will even show up on set. For Howard, managing a talent like Sizemore was an exercise in industrial ethics. How do you protect a massive production that employs hundreds of people and consumes millions of dollars when one of the key elements is a human being in the midst of personal disintegration? Howard has often reflected on the sadness of witnessing immense talent overshadowed by personal demons. He saw Sizemore as part of a broader cautionary narrative in Hollywood, the actor who has the world at his feet but is dragged into the abyss by his own darkness. It wasn't a clash of monumental egos. It was a collision between the golden potential of a promising career and the harsh reality of human frailty. The friction with Sizemore also illuminated the limits of the nice guy diplomacy that Howard cultivated. When an actor's personal life begins to threaten the safety or morale of the entire cast, the director must transition from being an understanding mentor to becoming an unyielding guardian of the production. Howard had to learn the hard way that you can't negotiate kindly with someone in the throes of an existential crisis. This realization was sobering for a director who prided himself on creating supportive environments. Sizemore epitomized the evil of lost time, the hundreds of hours wasted by unjustifiable delays, the creative energy diverted to crisis management, and the pervasive feeling of being held hostage to the volatility of a single person. Moreover, Sizemore's presence served as a reminder of the industry's problem-fixing culture. At that time, studios were still trying to manage their stars' bad boy image through talent agents and coordinated interventions. Howard found himself caught up in this corporate machinery, trying to extract a decent performance from a man whose mental presence was often barely there. This experience taught Howard about the fragility of the entire filmmaking machine. He witnessed how even the most expensive and professional production in the world can be completely ruined by the chemical imbalance of a single individual. This transformed Howard into someone hyper-vigilant about casting, leading him to prioritize personal character as much as theatrical talent. In retrospect, the conflict with Sizemore had less to do with a specific fight on set and more to do with a fundamental disagreement about the sanctity of creative work. Howard considers filmmaking a sacred privilege. Sizemore, in his darkest moments, treated it as a burden or a distraction from his inner turmoil. This friction forced Howard to define his own professional boundaries. It showed him that while he could be a kind person, he could not become a doormat for someone else's chaos. He learned that the greater good in filmmaking is protecting the collective effort, even if that means making the difficult decision to distance himself from a friend or talent who is no longer reliable. Sizemore remains a ghost in Howard's career, a permanent reminder of what happens when Hollywood's gilded cage offers too much money and too little personal responsibility. He was the emblem of anguish in Howard's experience, a man whose friction not only heated up the set, but set the entire structure ablaze. Through Sizemore, Howard learned that the hardest part of directing is not the actors who fight with you openly, but those who simply aren't present to face anything at all. Russell Crowe, The Volatile Alchemist. If Shelley Long's friction was intellectual work developed in slow motion, Russell Crowe represented a head-on collision at full speed. When Ron Howard selected Crowe to play John Nash in A Beautiful Mind, the actor was already legendary for his volatility, a man whose physical intensity and explosive temper were as famous as his Oscar-worthy talent. Howard, the eternal seeker of collaborative harmony, was suddenly tasked with directing A Volatile Alchemist, an artist convinced that great art can only be forged in the scorching heat of a high-pressure furnace. It was not merely a clash of cinematic styles, but a collision of diametrically opposed temperaments. The friendly guy next door versus the relentless gladiator. Crowe brought a methodical intensity to the set that often translated into a desire for absolute creative control. He didn't simply play John Nash, he inhabited him completely and expected the entire production to adapt to the demands of that total occupation. Howard has recounted that Crowe asked difficult but valid questions, which is the director's polite way of referring to intense debates lasting several hours over a single line of dialogue or the precise placement of a prop. Crowe was a man who used his intelligence and intimidating physical presence to dominate any space he occupied. On the set of A Beautiful Mind and later on Money Monster, the friction was palpable to everyone present. Crowe was known throughout the industry for his irascible temper, and he became famous for having had a physical altercation with a producer during an awards ceremony at the time, and that latent danger accompanied him to the soundstage. For Howard, directing Crowe was a master class in the crushing weight of unfiltered brilliance. He understood that with certain actors, the problem isn't a lack of professionalism, but an excess of it. A commitment so deep and immersive that it becomes potentially destructive to the social fabric of the entire team. Howard had to act like an expert lion tamer, providing enough space for Crow's uncontrollable genius to manifest itself without allowing it to damage the supporting cast or the shooting schedule. The friction here revolved primarily around boundaries. Crow was constantly pushing, and Howard, with his calm but firm style, had to push back with calculated precision. It was a high-stakes game of poker that played out over months of grueling filming, where the currency was mutual respect. One of the most famous examples of this friction occurred when Crow insisted on shooting A Beautiful Mind in strict chronological order, a logistical nightmare for any film production, let alone one with a relatively modest budget. Howard initially resisted, citing the inherently fragmented nature of the filmmaking process. But Crow was absolutely relentless. He argued passionately that John Nash's progressive psychological decline could not be convincingly faked by arbitrarily jumping around the narrative timeline. In a move unusual for a director, Howard eventually relented and modified his stance. He did not fight fire with fire, but instead attempted to channel it productively. However, the psychological cost to Howard proved significant and lasting. Unlike his sets with Tom Hanks or Steve Martin, where the atmosphere was one of light-hearted collaboration and natural camaraderie, the sets dominated by Crow were perpetually charged with workplace tension. There were days of uncomfortable silence, days of heated philosophical debates, and days when the air itself seemed charged with Crow's palpable dissatisfaction with some microscopic detail. Howard had to develop a new kind of director's skin, a shell that could absorb the blows of the lead actor's mercurial mood swings without being emotionally hurt. She learned a fundamental truth. Some actors don't want a kind and understanding director. They want an intellectual partner who is as obsessed and committed to excellence as they are. This period marked Howard's definitive transition from competent film director to true director of complex performances. By surviving Russell Crowe's creative fire, she categorically proved that she could handle the most dangerous and unstable elements Hollywood had to offer. He recognized an uncomfortable truth. The problem with a difficult temperament is often simply the shadow cast by truly immense talent. Crowe pushed Howard completely out of his traditional comfort zone, forcing him to abandon the psychological security of his Opie persona and transform himself into a leader, capable of commanding a room through his absolute technical competence and unshakable intellectual resilience. Howard and Crowe eventually emerged as professional friends and frequent collaborators, but the emotional scars of those early battles remained indelible. Crowe showed Howard that conflict is not always a negative thing to be avoided. Sometimes it is precisely the necessary fuel that drives a cinematic masterpiece. He was the first to show Howard that the good guy can only prevail if he is also simultaneously the strongest, most prepared, and most competent man in the room. By mastering the difficult art of clashing with Crowe, Howard earned a new kind of stripe in the film industry, the solid reputation of a man capable of taming the seemingly untamable. Shelley Long, the purgatory of the perfectionist. While Yul Brynner's authoritarian dominance was a relic of a disappearing film empire, Shelley Long represented a modern and considerably more cerebral type of friction. In 1982, Ron Howard found himself at a defining professional crossroads. He was no longer the child actor passively subjected to the influence of established icons. He was a young director trying to prove he had the authority to direct a major feature film. The project was Night Shift, a comedy that required a delicate balance between uncontrolled energy and authentic, realistic feeling. Howard found Shelley Long to be an undeniably brilliant comedian, but he also found her to be a problematic analytical anchor, an actress whose creative process was so meticulous and questioning that it constantly threatened to bring production to a complete halt. Long came from the rigorous world of Second City in Chicago, a theatrical environment that obsessively emphasized intellectual deconstruction and deep, psychological motivation of characters. While Michael Keaton improvised at breakneck speed and Henry Winkler was naturally carried along by his innate warmth, Long frequently brought the set to a halt with lengthy analytical pauses. She didn't want to simply deliver the written lines. She wanted to understand the complete molecular structure of why her character Belinda would choose precisely those specific words at that particular moment. For Howard, this process was a forced baptism into the complex world of managing difficult stars. He wasn't simply directing a commercial film, He was negotiating a fragile peace treaty on a daily basis between the inflexible production schedule and the obsessive perfectionism of an inflexible star. The friction with Long did not stem from personal malice, but from a fundamental mismatch in work rhythms. Howard, having grown up in the highly efficient world of television sitcoms where time literally is money, greatly valued constant momentum. Long, on the other hand, seemed to conceive of the set as an experimental laboratory where every hypothesis had to be thoroughly tested. Later reflections from the industry and cast of that era often paint a portrait of an actress who was not always the easiest to work with professionally. Not because she was a diva in the traditional sense of fur coats and theatrical tantrums, but because she was a perfectionist who could be completely oblivious to the practical needs of the production team. On the set of Night Shift, this manifested itself in the form of endless questions and an insatiable desire for one more take long after the director was completely satisfied with the material captured. Howard had to learn a vital lesson about directing psychology in real time. The analytical anchor does not consciously try to be problematic. They are desperately trying to be emotionally secure. For Long, the microscopic scrutiny of every detail was a psychological shield against potential failure. But for a director with time and budget constraints, that protective shield can quickly turn into an insurmountable wall. Howard found himself in a delicate position where he had to constantly validate Long's legitimate concerns. Literally, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I think I already knew that I loved this business, and that someday I wanted to be a director, Howard would later reflect. This situation represented a classic scenario where an actor uses their intelligence as a subtle form of hierarchical control. If they can intellectually outsmart the director, they can effectively take over the entire set. The tension was exacerbated by certain technical habits Long had developed over the years, habits that would later become notorious on the set of Cheers. Rumors circulated that she would accidentally move in ways that forced the camera to stay focused on her, a subtle form of scene stealing that deeply frustrated her castmates. On Night Shift, this created a competitive atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the collaborative family environment Howard longed to create. He realized a fundamental truth. The job of a director is not exclusively about the camera and lighting. It is fundamentally about managing the gravity of the stars. Long possessed immense gravitational pull, and if Howard did not remain absolutely firm in his decisions, the entire film would inevitably be sucked into her singular, narcissistic orbit. This experience was a critical turning point for Howard's leadership style. He understood that simply being a nice guy was not enough in Hollywood. He had to transform himself into a clear and firm guy. He learned to set firm boundaries with artists who mistakenly equated thoroughness with productive stagnation. He also learned to genuinely appreciate the end result, even when the journey was emotionally draining. Undoubtedly, Long is brilliant in Night Shift, bringing in authentic emotional vulnerability to Belinda that a less committed actress would likely have overlooked. Howard retrospectively acknowledged that the constant friction did indeed produce a polished diamond, but the intense heat of that friction nearly melted the production machinery completely. In hindsight, the conflict with Shelley Long is a classic example of the eternal director's dilemma. How much of a star's difficult behavior is justifiably tolerated for the sake of an exceptional performance? The particular challenge for Howard was that Long constantly sought her own artistic voice through endless questioning. She showed him that even in a seemingly superficial comedy about morgue employees and escort services, the internal psychological battles constitute the real human drama. She was the first person to clearly show him that the most difficult thing to direct is not technical lighting or the written script. It is the human ego carefully disguised as legitimate artistic work. Yul Brynner, The Tyranny of the Icon. If Francis Bavier represented the cold internal resentment of a gradually fading golden age, Yul Brynner was precisely the opposite, a fiery external spectacle that demanded that all the planets in the room orbit exclusively around him. Ron Howard met Brynner on the set of the 1959 film The Journey. Howard was just 5 years old, a little red-haired boy who was suddenly thrown into the overwhelming presence of a man who not only played a king but genuinely believed himself to be one. Brynner, world-famous for his completely shaved head and authoritative, resonant voice in The King and I, possessed an aura of absolute power that made no concessions to the vulnerable presence of a small child. This was Howard's first direct encounter with the divine right of kings, an archetype characteristic of Hollywood's golden age, where the star was not simply a competent lead actor, but an absolute sovereign ruler of the production set. Brenner's problem, if it can be appropriately called that, was fundamentally a sophisticated form of systematic psychological intimidation. He moved through the production with a rigid and frankly terrifying grace. For a child like Howard, accustomed to the gentle, paternal guidance of his own father, Rance Howard, Brenner represented a completely alien and disconcerting force. He was not a man who spoke conversationally. He issued imperial decrees. He did not walk ordinarily. He processed ceremoniously through spaces. Howard vividly recalls that Brenner's relentless intensity genuinely frightened him as a child. The actor possessed a particular way of looking through people rather than directly into their eyes, a technique carefully designed to perpetually maintain his status as the most important person in any room he occupied. In the film world of the 1950s, stars like Brenner were protected by a monolithic studio system that treated them literally as untouchable gods, and Brenner leaned into that artificial divinity with every fiber of his disciplined being. This experience was a master class in the atmosphere of institutionalized fear. Howard watched, fascinated and terrified, as adult members of the technical crew, experienced professionals who had worked on dozens of major films, eagerly rushed to indulge Brenner's every whim. If the lighting wasn't perfect, if a line was mispronounced, if the overall energy on set wasn't exactly to his liking, Brenner's disapproval manifested itself not as constructive conversation, but as a complete and oppressive climate change. For Howard, this was a formative experience in understanding how a single, oversized ego can completely hijack an inherently collective creative process. It was the absolute antithesis of the collaborative spirit that Howard would passionately champion decades later as an established director. Brenner was the immovable object, a man whose fanatical commitment to his own personal myth far outweighed any consideration for the comfort or dignity of his professional colleagues. The friction here did not stem from any specific personal animosity. It is unlikely that Brenner even considered a 5-year-old child to be a professional colleague with whom it was worth holding any grudge. Rather, it represented a fundamental clash of incompatible life philosophies. Howard was organically learning the Midwestern American work ethic: be prepared, be kind, and function as an integral part of the team. Brenner represented the continental European style at its finest: be the complete spectacle, be the unattainable mystery, and be indisputably the absolute master. Howard later noted that Brenner's presence was so overwhelmingly intense that it literally seemed as if the oxygen physically left the room when he majestically entered. This was not simply conventional stardom. It was a refined form of professional tyranny that was fundamentally based on the systematic subordination of the identity of everyone else present. Brenner also possessed a legendary penchant for absolute control of his public image. He was a talented photographer and a man of refined high culture, but these interests often served to further distance him from the common people on the film set. He had no desire to engage in casual everyday chatter or the natural camaraderie that fosters a sense of psychological security in a vulnerable young artist. Instead, he deliberately maintained an impenetrable wall of cultivated exoticism. He was perpetually the other, a figure of such intensely concentrated seriousness that it bordered on the frankly absurd. Howard, even at his young age, could clearly sense that this was not simply professional acting. It was fundamentally a complete lifestyle of rigorously controlled mastery. Decades later, when Howard finally transitioned into becoming an established director, the imposing ghost of Yul Brynner probably remained perched on his metaphorical shoulder as a permanent reminder of precisely what he should never do with his own power. Howard's sets are notoriously relaxed and egalitarian, a direct and conscious reaction to the authoritarian emperor model he traumatically witnessed in his formative youth. Brynner taught him an uncomfortable truth. While fear can indeed produce powerful performance in the short term, it also inevitably creates a fragile environment where people are too afraid to innovate creatively or take artistic risks. Brynner clearly showed him that cultural icons are often oppressive cages, not only for the people who work under them, but also for the legendary actors themselves, who must constantly and relentlessly perform their own manufactured greatness. The time Howard spent exposed to Brynner was a formative baptism by fire. It taught him unequivocally that Hollywood was not simply an enchanted playground. It was fundamentally a ruthless hierarchy. To survive successfully, one had to learn to stand firm even in the crushing shadow of an intimidating giant. Brenner was the ultimate embodiment of the darkest and most problematic trait of the Golden Age, the ingrained belief that artistic genius automatically grants license to be completely emotionally unreachable. He was a king without a tangible kingdom, ruling a soundstage despotically with an unyielding iron fist. Ron Howard emerged from that experience wondering if there was an alternative way to reach the absolute top without completely losing one's essential humanity in the process. Ron Howard survived 5 difficult personalities, but other filmmakers were not so lucky. Directors who quit, careers that were destroyed, and legends that fell into oblivion because they did not know how to handle these egos. Do you want to hear the stories that the industry prefers to keep quiet? Then subscribe and don't miss the next videos. Thank you for joining us.